Hey, it's Michael again from For Performance from Bike Doctors Hornchurch and from the Enduro Mike YouTube channel. This is video 3 in our series talking about bike fitting. So we now know what a bike fit is. I've had a talk to you about what actually happens in a session. What I want to talk about in this video is the 3 pillars of bike fitting and why each of those may be important to you depending on what type of cycling that you do. I think that was almost English. Anyway, so what are the 3 pillars? Now, the 3 pillars are power, aerodynamics, and comfort. Those are the 3 things that we tend to focus on, and people who come for a bike fit want to maximize out of their sessions. So let's define those first of all and talk about how they are impacted by how we move on a bike and how a bike is set up for us. So the first one is going to be power. Now, there's a lot of talk about power in the world of cycling now. Power meters came out, I think the first power meters arrived about 15 years ago, maybe? 10, 15 years ago. They were massively expensive, only the pros had them, and actually not all pros had them because they were so expensive. They have become far more accessible now and a lot easier to work with. Okay, so now you can get them as part of your pedals, which is really straightforward. And you can pick them up for sort of £200 to £300. So there has been a lot of emphasis and a big shift in focus towards power generation as cyclists. But how does bike fitting impact power? Well, if we think back to, or we think about biomechanics in general, the way that you sit on your bike and the way the bike is set up for you will have a huge impact on how you can move the power from your body. So when we talk about the quadriceps, the hamstrings and the glutes, in the legs, into the bike, which ultimately will drive you forwards. And if you remember that every human being is a different shape, then it kind of makes it clear that bike fitting can have a huge impact on how you put that power through. So the biggest thing that really impacts your power is your cleat setup in your shoes, the shoes themselves, and your seat setting. Okay. So I'm going to talk from the top and go down. The first one that impacts it is your seat. So whether your seat is too far back or too far forward, or whether it's balanced, will have an impact on the muscles that you use whilst you're cycling. As we go further back, we tend to engage the glutes and the hamstrings a little bit more to drive the pedals. As we go further forward with the seat, we tend to use our quadriceps a little bit more. If we find a balance, then we can get our quadriceps, our hamstrings, and our glutes all working together effectively to drive those pedals down. Now, there is a little bit of movement around this depending on the type of cycling that you do. So when you're climbing, you'll be in a slightly different position to when you're riding on the flat. Also, when you're riding in an aerodynamic position, you will be slightly different as well. So your seat setup is quite specific to what you will be looking at doing the majority of the time. If we then come down into the knees and the ankles, we look at the shoe setup. If you have a lot of what we call, or what I would call additional movement as you pedal, so if you can think your knees should track straight up and down, if they start moving out or moving in, that's what I call accessory movement. And that accessory movement, at best, will waste energy because you're using other muscles to try and stabilize that movement. At worst, will cause injuries over time. So what we really want to do is we want to focus on getting your knees nice and aligned over the top of your feet and keeping that movement straight up and down, because that's where we drive the most power into our pedal. So that brings us down to cleat setup. So setting your cleats so that they're not too close together in terms of the width between your 2 feet. They're not too far apart, and they're also nice and straight, but also allow you the correct amount of what we call float so that you can keep a nice, steady pedaling style. When we look at shoes, shoes have a big impact as well. If you think about the difference between a cycling shoe and a running shoe, running shoes are there to absorb energy and absorb impact. So if you try and cycle with a running shoe, you're going to absorb a lot of the power that you're putting through that just into the foam of the shoe. That's why cycling shoes have very hard, very stiff soles. But too stiff of a sole can have an impact on your foot comfort. So it's worth finding a shoe that suits your foot in terms of width, in terms of length, and in terms of firmness, which is something that we look at while we're doing a fit for you. And those are the kind of elements that come into finding the correct power. It's about getting the right joint alignments, it's about minimizing energy sapping movements, and about getting the correct amount of stiffness into the pedal to drive them round. So next up we have aerodynamics. So aerodynamics is all about hiding from the wind. Now there are a lot of interesting facts around about aerodynamics. The main one being that when you ride at 25 miles an hour, anywhere between 80 to 90% of the energy that you use is about overcoming wind resistance. So therefore it kind of makes sense that aerodynamics have a huge impact on cycling. And they do. There is a lot of debate about how much aerodynamics make a difference to you when you're going slower. And yes, by percentage, the wind resistance as you go slower is less, so you have to put in less energy to overcome that wind. But remember that if you're going slower, you're going to be riding for longer, so the total amount of energy used gets bigger. But that's a discussion for another time. So when we talk about aerodynamics, it's about making you as small as possible front on. So for somebody who comes to see me for a time trial or triathlon fit, what I'll be looking at doing is making the hole that they make through the air as small as possible. So we'll look at how your head sits on top of your shoulders and make sure that that's as, I'm just looking down, don't know why. Make sure that's as solid as possible. We'll look at making your elbows come in as tight as possible to the body and just making your whole package as small as we can. Now, interestingly enough, there's loads of focus on fast bikes, time trial bikes and aero bikes and all of the other bikes that you can get that supposedly cheat the wind, which is great. And it's absolutely brilliant to spend 5, 10, 15,000 pounds on a wind cheating bike if you can afford to do that. But what people don't tend to realize is that 80% of the drag that is created in the package of a bike and rider comes from the rider rather than the bike. So if you are investing a lot of money in an aero bike, then you should definitely invest the 150 or 200 pounds that it is to get a proper aero bike fit done to maximize that, because 80% of your drag is coming from you, not from your bike. And finally, we have comfort. Now, a lot of people come to me whenever they're having a bike fit done and say, oh, I just want aerodynamics, I don't want comfort. And I was like, okay, well, that's fine. But think about it this way. If you're doing a 5-mile time trial, fine. 10 to 15 minutes in that position, absolutely brilliant. Comfort doesn't really matter that much. You're not really going to get impacted by it. If you're doing a 10-mile time trial and you're trying to go fast, you're trying to go under 20 minutes, again, under 20 minutes in a less than comfortable position, you can probably deal with. But once we go further than that, once we get up to 25 miles, 50 miles, if you're a triathlete, this is even more important because you're thinking about having to run after the bike. Comfort becomes a huge thing. Because you could have the most aerodynamic position in the world, but if you can only hold that for 20 minutes and you're going to be on the bike for 2.5 hours, you're going to be in trouble. Because I can guarantee you the position that you go to after the 20 minutes is going to be very, very, very unaerodynamic, and all of the gains that you get from that super aerodynamic position will be lost. So comfort is a huge element as well. And it doesn't matter whether you are a sportive rider looking to spend a day on your bike or you're trying to win your age group in an Ironman triathlon. Comfort has to be one of the deciding factors. The only time we would start to not look at comfort is in things like very short time trials and in things like individual pursuit track racing. And you can see that as well if you look at the professional cycling world. If you look at somebody like Geraint Thomas, or from further back like Bradley Wiggins, if you look at how they rode on the track in their individual and team pursuit position, it differs slightly, Now those guys are mega flexible, so they can hold that position for longer, but it would differ slightly from their position for something like a 25-mile time trial. Okay? Because comfort allows you to stay in position and to generate power. So those are the three elements. And what do we do when we do a bike fit? Well, as I've said a couple of times, probably in this video and in the other videos, it depends on what you're looking for. But ultimately, it's about finding the balance between those three things. A very powerful position will not tend to be that aerodynamic. There's not really that carryover. Likewise, a very aerodynamic position generally is not as powerful as a very powerful position. And then comfort comes in and sits on top of those. So it will depend on what it is that ultimately you're looking for. But that would be something to discuss with your fitter, so that whenever they do your fit, they can take all of those elements into account. As I said previously, if you would be interested in booking a bike fit session, there is a link below where you can see what we do. And you can see the pricing and stuff. Other than that, thank you for watching. Again, we'll have your final video for you coming up in a couple of days, where we will look at whether you should have a bike fit and when you should have a bike fit, because when you should have a bike fit is a very important point as well. Thanks. See you later.